Happy New Year, everybody, from the Fantasy Animation Podcast. It's Alex here. I hope you had a great celebrations into 2024, or indeed, if you're listening in the future, 2025, 2026, 2027, and so on and so on. God, if I'm still podcasting at that point, do send me an email and tell me to stop. We've got a very exciting year coming up on the pod. We've got lots of episodes in the can already that I'm really, really excited to share with you all, including this one, which is a real treat for me at least, but a treat for Chris as well. We finally did The Dark Crystal, the cult puppet classic from the 1980s that I've been desperate for us to do for some time. We also did it with a really special guest from the British Library to time in with their exhibit on fantasy, which runs till the end of February. You'll hear more about that in the main pod. Just one note before it goes. We recorded this at the library itself. They were very kind to have us over. It was just before Christmas. And because we were really excited and because everything was going really well, something had to go wrong, and of course it did. There was some hiccup with the microphones. I haven't even quite worked out what happened really. Something to do with one of them not recording properly. Mine certainly didn't pick me up very well. Anyway, I've been through it. I've had a good old go. AI got involved at some point, and then got uninvolved because it wasn't working very well. And I've done my best. I sound quite echoey. Chris sounds annoyingly good and crisp and clear, but you can hear everything, okay? But bear with a bit of sound problems and a few sound difficulties. And as I said, we did record it in the library, so you might hear some background noises or a weird sound here or there as part of the conversation. So apologies for that, but you'll be able to bear with it, and it's a really great discussion. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your reactions. Enjoy the show. Hello listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, today we are doing a film I've wanted us to do on the podcast for quite a while, The Dark Crystal.
Yep.
Jim Henson's fully puppeteered classic from the 1980s, dark fantasy spectacular. I guess we're going to get into the perennial debate as to whether puppets count as animation or not. So I'm already excited to hear that. We do that again, even though we've already done it on the show.
We do it again, and we do it better.
Anything you're particularly excited to talk about this week?
I'm excited to talk about your work on the film's animation. So I get to sort of sit back and enjoy you talking about the film in relation to kind of puppetry, and I guess things about sort of the way that we might think about like the sets and the costumes, as I think people have talked about it in relation to kind of archaeologies of material. We have a history of effects, and we have a history that you can kind of reach out and touch. So a bit about labour, a bit about animation, a bit about puppets.
Cool, and we're doing it at a good time because
we are.
If people are fans of certainly those who are UK listeners and are fans of The Dark Crystal and want to see any of these costumes, set designs, and learn more about the history of the film, there is a fabulous new exhibit on at the British Library entitled Fantasy Realms of Imagination, and it runs till the 25th of February 2024. So those who are listening to this have a month now to go and buy their tickets.
Yes.
And we are joined with Phil.
We're here, and we're doing it.
In the British Library.
We are.
And we're thrilled to be joined by Tanya Kirk, who is the lead curator of fantasy here, and is responsible for some of the wonderful exhibits in the new exhibition, but particularly the stuff on The Dark Crystal that I was most interested to see when I looked through it a few weeks ago. So Tanya, thanks for joining us on the show first.
Thanks for having me.
No, we're thrilled to have you here, Tanya.
Yeah, we are.
We're really excited to talk about The Dark Crystal with you. I guess because it's timed with this exhibition and there's some really wonderful items from the movie on display. And your exhibition, for those who haven't come across it before, sort of does this really ambitious thing of trying to tell the map, the history of fantasy, kind of within Britain, but actually kind of across the world as well. It's a really ambitious but really wonderful exhibition. Yeah. We've only got an hour with you, so I don't think we can go into all of it right now. But
look how excited he is. Look, Alex, this is like fantasy. This is you, isn't it?
My people. Anyway, yes, but I'd like to just ask you about The Dark Crystal and why you were so keen to get that film this weird little 80s movie with puppets in it into the story of kind of the wider world of fantasy and how that came about?
So I guess there's two things to say. The first one being that where this appears in the exhibition is a section that looks at the history of world building, and we really wanted to get across how much craft goes into world building, and that it's not just everyone knows that lots of fantasy novels come with a map, but they don't necessarily know how much goes into that, and that people are designing maps that go way beyond the world that is actually portrayed in the novel. For films and TV, often world building is just so immense that people are kind of creating whole like backstories, cultures, creatures, histories, like mythologies. It's all kind of, it makes the world seem real to us, but it's also like a really beautiful process where people are coming up with all of this stuff, and it's I think the Dark Crystal really epitomises that for me. It's such a kind of well-crafted thing, and it's so well thought through, and it all looks so kind of like lived in and not shiny and new, but like it kind of exists outside the film itself. And that's what I love about it now as an adult, but also it was my favourite film when I was a child. So that was the real reason why I wanted to put it in. And I used to bamboozle my parents by putting on my Christmas list the crystal shard from the Dark Crystal, which they were always a bit like, oh, what do we do with this?
She's put it on there again.
It's in the exhibition. I finally got it.
Excellent.
On loan.
Yeah. For you and your child self. Congrats. Yeah. Okay, wow. So you decided to that you wanted it to be part of the story. Mm-hmm. You're the creator of fantasy. I mean, that is a good job. But so what do you do then? And just for those, because I reckon there'll be some listeners who are interested in the idea of being a curator, but might not know what it means beyond the kind of title. How does one curate an exhibit on fantasy, particularly here at the British Library? And also, what did you go about in terms of items to do with the Dark Crystal? Where did you source them? I'm assuming you didn't have them in-house? But
no, we didn't have them in-house. So my lead curator of fantasy is only kind of my temporary role while I work on this exhibition. I do have a kind of a normal role at the British Library, which has a very long job title. Lead curator, Printed Heritage Collections, 1601 to 1900. So that's my kind of normal job, which I can talk about later. But my role on fantasy was to lead the curatorial team on the exhibition. So work out the storyline, source all of the exhibits, write all of the text, kind of make sure that it all made sense and was kind of laid out well in the gallery, worked with designers, and then promote the exhibition around the opening time. So it's been really exciting. And sourcing Dark Crystal things, we were really, really lucky that we had an advisory board for the exhibition. On that advisory board was Terry Windling, who is a kind of amazing fantasy author and really important, significant editor of fantasy as well. And she is a neighbour of Brian and Wendy Froud, who are the production designer and one of the puppeteers on the Dark Crystal. So that link kind of came through Terry. So a lot of stuff is owned by the Henson Corporation, some of which is in London, so we borrowed two artworks that were by Brian Froud but are now owned by the Henson Corporation, and then the costumes they just had in their house. So
So for a limited time, people come and see the stuff that's normally hanging in Brian and Wendy Froud's front room.
Yeah. I think because we've wanted to talk. I think on this podcast we've talked a lot about fantasy and animation in regards to curation, and curation almost being this missing link between people at universities talking about things and putting things into particular categories and saying these things fit into, this is animation for these reasons, this is fantasy for these reasons, or this is a Western for these, this is a science. So there's that happening in universities, and then there's and also university academics kind of claiming that things aren't those things, that doesn't fit into that category, and I think we've talked about animation and fantasy in terms of how it's been curated on things like a Netflix, actually anything from Netflix to the shelf of a library. Where does a book on fantasy and animation sit, and what are some of the interesting kind of politics with a small p of putting that book in the fantasy section rather than the animation? You're making claims about where things go. And then then you have kind of the act of curation itself, which is people can talk about things that are or are not fantasy, or things that animation is not a genre is the big one.
Yeah.
But actually, if you go onto Netflix and Amazon and animation is absolutely a genre, and it functions in the real world like a genre. So rather than reject the way that things function generically, you go, well, maybe it functions like a genre for some people in some context. So I think we're always really this idea of curation. What you're choosing to put a film, let's say, and it might be something that's close in terms of your childhood, but also that you want to best represent the idea of fantasy and the realm of imagination that fantasy as a mode, as an impulse, as a genre brings. So actually you're doing, and this sounds really ridiculous to say, but you're doing important, but actually like the importance of you making claims about things means that we can now point to something and go, well, that's fantasy because you say it is, and it's been 100%. Curated like that.
Yeah, we have had quite a lot of comments from people who've said, "Oh, I'd never really thought of these things as
classic
fantasy."
Yeah.
And people have said, like, why have you got Utopia by Thomas More in the exhibition when obviously fantasy did not exist in 1516? That's not a kind of it wasn't an established genre till way later.
Yeah.
But what we wanted to look at was like what fantasy takes from these kind of earlier forms of storytelling, and how it's like using those things to enrich itself and become like a more interesting genre.
Well, I suppose all of these things, or the way that I guess the curation of these objects like fantasy involved tracing genealogies and finding proto-forms of these things. But that's surely how genres work anyway. You have that any cultural, you have the chaotic early period where you're going, I don't know if that's a thing, but maybe it's a thing. Then you have the sort of classic period, whether it's Disney, whether it's whatever it is, that sort of canonizes some of the classic text. And then you have subversion of the thing. And then by the end of it, you have absolute extreme postmodern genres flipping back on themselves. But that's how things move through the world. So you can curate fantasy and say, and when people ask why isn't that included, you go, well, I can kind of trace these little threads, and this is kind of how genres are alive and mobile, and they're not historical. They're not ahistorical. They're historically contingent because they're feeding off all these other art forms, and there's these really interesting cross-pollinations between different forms of fantasy. So it's sort of, I suppose one of the good things about exhibitions like this, and it sort of you problematize in a really productive way what people think fantasy is. It's not, I know you do this anyway in your own work, it's not just dragons and orcs, and it's the bit at the end of Greece where the car flies up for literally no reason. And you're like, well, that's fantasy. So that's my that's when I'm teaching fantasy. I'm like, it's not. It's so I really like this side of curation is this really interesting middle ground between what people think something is and what people say something is, and then you in the middle mediating those discussions.
He's also got a really good staging ground to kind of allow people to kind of make those links organically.
Yeah.
What I loved about seeing the Dark Crystal items, and it's towards the end of the exhibit that it turns up, is I hadn't seen obviously these items before because I've not been in Brian and Wendy's front room, alas. But I have seen sort of other, because there's so, for those who are fans of this movie, there's so much world building. We're going to get to world building.
Yes, we are.
Kind of material out there. In terms of both what they had to do to make the finished thing, but also the kind of pre-production stuff.
Yeah.
And it's often contained within exhibits on special effects, which are fun as well. And I'm looking over to my co-host to make sure he doesn't get too offended. But what that does, it's all kind of put within this kind of the development of kind of of special effects and what you can lose when you see these items in that, when it's put up against, a Terminator costume and kind of all the other kind of fun creature effects of the 80s and things like that, is it's all about technical innovation.
Yeah.
But where's the imagination? Where's the magic? And these costumes are magical,
That's one of the things I really love about the Dark Crystal, is that it's also kind of analog, because they were just inventing stuff, and it was all just... there's an amazing documentary on YouTube about the making of it, which I watched recently, and I didn't realise that there were sort of 5 people below every single person, manoeuvring or bits of the costume, because they didn't have the kind of effects that we have now, but it makes it all seem so much more believable. And I guess it's the kind of it's why the original Star Wars films, people love those effects that were created by them shooting up ping pong tables, whatever it was they did, but they hated Jar Jar Binks. It's that it's just so much more real to people.
Yeah, there's a tangibility to it that absolutely. And you mentioned the word craft.
Yeah.
We're very interested in craft. I wonder if you could. Do you want to start by saying a little bit more about what you mean by that word? Because it's such an interesting word and such a useful word to apply to something like The Dark Crystal. Because I think you're right. It's a film full of craft.
Yeah.
But you also wouldn't say that going back off, you wouldn't say Jar Jar Binks is crafted in the same way.
No.
I think by craft I mean I'm a big fan of the word, because I think that in the past people have been kind of sniffy about it and thought that it's not art, is it? It's kind of patronised a bit, but craft I think is a more kind of collaborative process maybe. With The Dark Crystal it was a real like coming together of people sharing their skills and kind of furthering the goal of the overall film through that. And just like really practical stuff, like they were making things out of nothing. They were making things out of the Augurer's orrery was made out of glued together, the prototype was made out of glued together Muppet eyes from the Muppet Workshop. Like they were just like kind of spiriting these things out of random stuff. I think that's incredible.
It's you're right. It's a word that's often so it's used derisively and it's often, you know, there's lots of scholarship on this, but it's often
quite gendered.
It's often gendered. It's often gendered. It's a form of artistic labour that's not valued as much as, well, again, if we go back to this kind of the VFX exhibitions would not be a celebration traditionally of craft, whatever that word means. It's a celebration of usually single technical ingenuity, right? Well, again, not that they are, because a lot of these costumes look beautifully crafted, but that's not how they're framed. That's not how they're curated. But this film is a celebration of craft. I think those special. I suspect I know the documentary you're talking about. I think it was on the DVD of it when DVDs.
Oh, was it? I don't know.
No, yeah.
Right.
Well,
of course you do. Of course you know.
It's about 45 minutes long, something like that. Yeah. And there's loads of stuff on the kind of workshop floor, and the workshop is a useful term.
Yeah.
And I think when the film came out, that was a real huge part of the publicity of the movie, because they really wanted to get across this kind of the labour of love of this kind of this world built on screen. This film, we haven't set up the plot. I'm sure listeners who are listening to this is not the best way to be introduced to any movie. So I'm sure by now they've seen the movie. They usually have. But perhaps we could start by kind of, if you can, give us a sense for those who haven't encountered it or need reminding what the film is. Maybe we should start with that 20 minutes in. And why world building was this thing that you just felt like it needs to go there in the exhibition?
So it does literally take place in another world, which is called Thra, and this world is kind of had a split, and that has. It's going to be really hard to explain.
That's why Alex got you to do it.
I know. I was thinking that.
Sitting that smug now.
A shard broke away from the Dark Crystal, and in that moment, the kind of some of the main inhabitants of this planet split into two kind of races, which are the Skeksis, which are the kind of evil lizard-like, scheming, kind of unnatural beings, and the Mystics, which are these kind of beautifully spiritual, lots of like Celtic kind of symbolism in them, and they're like gentle beings. There's a prophecy that
Of course there is, always is.
It's loads of classic fantasy tropes in it. There's a prophecy that a Gelfling, which is a kind of a different race, like a more kind of humanoid figure, kind of elfin person, will bring about the end of the Skeksis and heal the crystal. And so the Skeksis have historically wiped out all of the Gelflings. However, they missed two. And that's the premise, is the two Gelflings come together to try and find the crystal shard and then heal the crystal. And it's kind of quite a simple, classic fantasy story, quite slight. It's only like 90 minutes long. But it's just all about the look and feel of it as a film, I think, that makes it special.
It's, first off, Amazing synopsis, Chris. We can learn from that. Second, I think it's the film's. I loved the film as a kid too, and I think the film is Lord of the Rings-esque, and I don't mean that in a derisory way.
No.
I mean in two ways. One, the plot is obviously quite Lord of the Ringsy.
It's a quest to find a thing, to do a
Gelflings
thing.
are a bit hobbity.
They're
shards
short.
are a bit ringy. All this kind of stuff.
See, I went with Ewoks. Carry on.
Which also are a bit hobbity, but
Yeah,
fine.
yeah,
Okay. But I can see the Ewok connection in terms of the puppetry. So yeah, all right. Okay, he's nodding. And so there's that, and it's kind of post sort of mid sort of 60s 70s Lord of the Rings craze. So it's right in the heart of kind of fantasy and mysticism and counterculture and all this kind of stuff. But it's also Lord of the Rings-esque in the more important sense, in that that's the plot.
Yeah.
But it's the plot is really a kind of a guiding post through a world.
Yeah.
And really the pleasure of the movie is these intricate, felt peoples, beings, cultures, civilizations, worlds, worlds within worlds that you encounter as you see this quite easy to follow story. I think the film, people, I know you are, like, a lot of people think it's really weird and quite hard to understand.
Yep.
It isn't hard. The plot is quite easy to understand. What feels dense about the movie is just this sense of a world going on that we're
it's
only
way
partially,
beyond.
which is kind of similar to Lord of the Rings in that respect.
Yeah.
So I guess one, just to affirm my own geekdom, is that also kind of your experience of watching the movie as a kid, is this idea that it's not so much the plot that's fascinating me, it's these creatures, it's these worlds, it's that thing on a rock over there in the corner of the screen.
100%.
And how did you then, when did you start to encounter the kind of story of the Dark Crystal, as in how they built this world on screen?
Well, I only really started researching that to do the exhibition. I just always loved the film, and then I'd kind of never thought that much. Like I had no idea that I had no idea how any of the puppets worked or anything. I didn't realise the Gelflings were like someone's hand up them, like a Punch and Judy puppet. It all blew my mind finding out more about it. I think one of the things that I find really interesting about it is the settings. So the way that they kind of contrast the world of the Skeksis, which is this kind of very artificial, they're in a castle, it's kind of quite, I don't know, it's not kind of like a rich surrounding because there's nothing in it, it's all very kind of organic, but it's kind of courtly, I guess. And then in contrast, the world of the Gelflings and the mystics and the pod people is all very rooted in the earth, and the pod people, which are literally like based around potatoes, that was the inspiration for them. And that kind of very beautiful landscape that all came from Brian Froud's surroundings in Devon, where he lives, kind of that made fantastical. I think that makes it really, that's kind of a really special thing about it. And then the other thing that I really love is the creature development, and as you'd expect from a Jim Henson film, so much went into that, and like the ways that they developed those creatures, and they got mime artists to do the puppetry so they could kind of get them to move in a way that was most suitable for each type of character. They had like a team working on each type of creature, so they were kind of developing every aspect of that creature, from like facial tics, and it's all so well thought through. I've lots of just things I want to ask. And so I think so I think that the world building is almost like there's two registers of craft. One is the craft of the puppets, and then there's the craft of the world building. So we love world building. We've talked about kind of, I think, this history of fantasy and animation, that the assumption around a lot of animated films is that obviously you only see the
they're only going to animate the bit that you see. They're not going to animate whatever. But the logic of world building, or the best worlds, are the ones where you believe that the world has organised itself into a series of stories, and you just happen to be watching this one.
Yes.
And things happen, and things are in the background, but they could connote. And there's a lot of writing on video games that talks about internal logic and coherency. And if you see a video game and you're passing through a level that has an open world that has ruins, then you're like, okay, so this world has a past. And things have become ruined. Maybe it was a war. What did people war about? Maybe it was religion. So maybe this is a world where... So you start to kind of fill in the gaps, and you build the world. And people writing on film worlds have talked about that worlds exist in a way where you build... That could never have existed in front of the camera, but you only need to hear the sound of a motor car to figure out that this is a world of the Industrial Revolution. And there are things and we've talked about this, where writers like Victor Perkins are like, film worlds are often worlds built from things that go without saying. Yeah, I can just assume if I see a police car, I know that there's a justice system and all the kind of things that are connoted by these sorts of things. So I agree. I think in fantasy, and fantasy lends itself well because it perhaps has to these kinds of, you need an internal logic, or you need a coherency, because you need to know when things are atypical or abnormal.
You need to not have people just constantly distracted, being like, well, how does that work?
Yeah.
Then? Because then it's not real to them anymore.
Yeah, wait until they hear about fiction. Wow. So there's the kind of internal... So I like the idea of... So I get what you mean about the idea of kind of... the world is crafted as much as the puppets within them and stuff. So there's a real attention to the way that cultures... I think you said cultures being civilizations. There's the... That all rings true, and this is why we don't care about realism, but we care about authenticity and credibility and coherency and believability and logic and all this kind of stuff. And also, so I think all the stuff around craft, around labour and skill and materiality and the imperfect and the gendered element is really important. The kind of domestic, there's the association with the handmade and craft and all these kinds of things. And so, I think, and also pantomime. So I was going to say that you said that the mime artists and things like that. So I got, because a lot of, not only were the first animated characters built on kind of silent performers. Yeah. So but silent performers were then also in these cartoons. So Felix the Cat meets Charlie Chaplin or whatever. Because animation is a silent medium, because the drawings don't make any noise, and the computers, the only noise they make is when they're about to explode or the heat. But all animation is a form of performance, and therefore, and it's also all pantomime. It's all pantomime, and so I wonder whether this kind of film, because I'm trying to think of what an exhibition of Pixar and the making of would look like, and it would just be a series of computers and printouts. Yeah. And it wouldn't have that. So I don't know. There's something really interesting about animation is this, and particularly this kind of puppet animation as a form of pantomime, and how important it is. Because I noticed the characters, the cast. It comes up with the cast, and the first bit is the character performers.
Yeah,
and I thought that was
the voice actors.
And I thought that was just a really interesting way of thinking about performance in this film. So I got excited.
I think if to use the Tolkien analogy, it's a glib one, but it's just helpful to unpack what we're talking about here. I mean, people talk about The Lord of the Rings as kind of being a kind of fantastical symphony I can't say the word today. Orchestra of language.
So that word was symphony.
Before I messed all that sentence up, I was going to say something really good about language, but I think I've just demonstrated the limits of language there. But Lord of the Rings is a world of language. Very famously, he invented the language.
Yeah.
All the story to tell you.
Yeah.
If that's The Lord of the Rings, I think the paradigm with the Dark Crystal, which I think is worth taking really seriously, but people often don't, is that the same thing happens with the Dark Crystal, but what we have here, it's like a dance, or it's about movement and bodies, and it's, if you look back on the kind of how they come up with this world, it's very much, they start with the creature, and if we put this still on, and we put this on, what kind of movement can we get out of this? And in what you can say about how it's a world built on a kind of fantastical play with movement and space and movement, but also the craft around that and things like that.
Well, I think for some of the characters, they came up with the movements first, and then they designed the character around how that movement could happen.
Yeah.
And, so the Landstriders, in the exhibition, we've got an amazing design for Landstriders that Brian did for the film. But he came up with that idea because one of the kind of puppeteers who was working on the film was a stilt walker as well, and was kind of messing around in the workshop, and he saw him walking on stilts and thought, I can create a character around this, and then realised that walking on stilts lets you actually move really fast because you have very long legs. So the Landstriders, and they're kind of fleeing, they can move really fast, and they also look so otherworldly. They're on 4 stilts, so they've got stilts on their arms as well. And it looks amazing and so weird, but it just came from him seeing someone messing around in the workshop.
That feels really specific to this kind of puppetry, this
I
world
think
of move, because you have films. So this is more contemporary computer animated films. So you take an object like a lamp, and then you cast and you figure out how it would move as if it were a parent, let's say, or what would a child lamp look like. So you cast an object and then work with its dimensions. You don't change the dimensions. You don't elongate you work with the limitations, and that's kind of what a lot of these computer animated films do. This seems absolutely fundamental, not just, this seems like to go back to exactly how these characters are conceived. As you say, you're trying to work within a set, out of these constraints comes sort of this creativity, and it seems to be quite specific. I know that you've written on puppetry, but it seems quite a specific way of thinking about animation, that it's actually perhaps in many ways like the purest form of animation, because it's all about movement, and that's really what animation is.
Yeah, and it comes across in the other characters, isn't it? You've got the kind of the Skeksis, who are kind of these sort of gnarly, brittle, almost rock-like, lots of sharp shapes and pointy angles, and it's really difficult to kind of describe the aesthetic of it, isn't it? But it's
and loads of clothes, like, because there's the kind of clothing in it is like a status symbol. So there's a battle, and to become the emperor, and the Chamberlain loses. He's one of the main characters, and they strip him of all his like gowns, and that is a complete loss of status for him. So it's all this kind of possessions making you more important, and
it's a really interesting sequence, because it's kind of towards the beginning of the movie they're sort of establishing the mythology of these creatures. And this emperor gets stripped, as you say, gets stripped down, and then there's also it's the Chamberlain, isn't it?
The Chamberlain
with
loses.
the most terrifying noise in the world.
I'd
let you do it once, but I've got a podcast.
I was going to say, I think we've just found our new theme tune. Just saying.
Sure. Yes, him, and that shot of him removed of these ornate clothes is so weird, particularly as I remember watching it as a child. Because it's both terrifying, because it's this still kind of scrawly, kind of dead bird, almost like the sort of thing you'd find in like the local park and wish you didn't.
Yeah.
And quite pathetic at the same time.
Yeah.
Like, it's this, it's uncannily unthreatening, because there is threat there, but it's and that's a really interesting metaphor for these characters, because that's exactly what they are. They're kind of built up and bunched up, and they're kind of layer upon layer and layer upon layer, and to create this thing that's sort of never it's like hollowness to them, kind of moral hollowness, whatever hollowness. But if you watch the performers, they're kind of having to perform
and
like
under
all
this stuff. So it's amazing that you kind of get this amazing sense of movement when they're just covered in layers of clothes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
it's that restriction, isn't it? It's that sense of things like that, and that's completely contrasted with the mystics, who are these kind of much more kind of earthbound. I was going to say the word relaxed, but not relaxed, but kind of stoic, calm,
plodding.
Chanting often, things like that. And again, their performance is much more kind of gestorial, much more kind of open-armed, all this kind of stuff. So it's definitely this really interesting imaginative use of movement that the film is. I mean, not even to mention sort of Frank Oz as Olga. Anything you want to say about Olga while we're on Olga?
Oh yeah, she's amazing.
What an interesting Gandalf, like, to have this kind of kind of feminized, but not really sure what gender Olga is, or even if Olga
she's
has
definitely a woman.
You reckon?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I really like that character, because it would have been, I think, really easy for them to just do some kind of very simplistic, like, the evil characters are really ugly and the good characters are kind of attractive looking and non-threatening, and then she is the most terrifying looking person, but is obviously this amazing strong powerhouse for good.
Yeah.
And kind of helps them out.
Yeah, and not graceful in any way, shape or form. You would have thought they might have gone that way, right? This kind of sage, old as time kind of presence in the world. But she's kind of like constantly ducking under things.
And takes her eye out and uses it to look at things.
Yeah. And like this bit where she sort of just sits down. It's like sort of like, you know, like getting into a chair at the end of the day. Kind of, there's a groaning age to her.
I love it.
Yeah. And then there's like, and to keep going on this sort of movement, there's the Jen the Gelfling.
Yeah.
And I remember in maybe the same documentary you both watched, maybe not, where there's a whole bit about them trying to get the walk of Jen right, because they're kind of constantly walking like they would like Kermit the Frog.
Yeah, they do
talk
talk about
exaggerated.
that.
I'm kind of bumping up and down in my chair because I've forgotten that this is a podcast.
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, thanks. But that doesn't come across like, so they basically to make Jen, they have to kind of try to kind of still it back to as little movement as possible.
Yeah.
And that's all.
Yeah, and also Jim Henson's performing Jen and is like a big man trying to perform this tiny elf.
This is interesting because I was thinking a couple of times on the podcast we've talked about 1982, like what was happening in 1982. E.T., The Dark Crystal, Tron, The Thing, the Snowman, Conan. So something was and also to continue the thing, Grease too. But the other films, it makes me think that we've got a bit of puppets. We've got kind of animatronics. We've got obviously Tron and digital technology. We've got Snowman and sort of that kind of painterly drawn pastel. And it made me think that there's 1982 is basically just loads of different films using different animated forms. And different ways of characters performing. So the way that you kind of acting out, trying to figure out how these characters perform and how do you make a digital object perform? How do you make a puppet perform? And also this idea of kind of gender. Often gender is often signpost. And when I teach gender and kind of queer theory and queerness, and we talk about Bugs Bunny and drag, and it's like rendition. People have written, that renditions. We think of a character in drag. Bugs Bunny's performing femininity in this particular moment, ignoring the fact that he performs masculinity 99% of the time, because everything is it's all a rendition of something. So this idea of sort of masculinity and femininity have to be performed in really interesting ways, and I'd never thought about it in relation to when you just said Jim Henson, who's a big man. So he's having to it's sort of a form of drag. He's having to perform but through the puppet in really interesting ways. But there's a lot of writing on gender and animation talks about something. It's all a performance. So it's all being kind of heterosexuality is as much, or masculinity or femininity is as much a rendition as homosexuality and queer. Like it's all a performance, or it's all performative. But that sort of cross gender performance where you have male performing as female, and how you then articulate femininity in quote marks through puppets.
Jen is a boy in that he's just a small elfin boy.
Right, okay. Oh, right. But I suppose you have the ways in which you're trying to translate the movement of one body into and you're having to. It's like the thing with puppetry is that the puppet exists between you and the audience. The audience and the puppeteer are both trained on the same thing, which is not like ballet where you are performing and you are being watched. In the case you're
trying
part
to be
of
invisible.
Yeah, so you're part of this like network of different ways of looking like performances. So the character is being performed by a puppet, and you are watching. But both of the animator and the audience are trained on this object that is in performance, and you're having to translate all these big movements or these into really dainty. Yeah. So I find that really interesting, but I never really thought about the potential implications for gender. What would happen if one performs as? But anyway,
interesting.
Well, Frank Oz performed as Orgara and
his Miss Piggy.
And his Miss Piggy, and there's in the documentary. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep talking about this. There's a little clip where you hear his voice instead of the voiceover, and it is like Miss Piggy performing. Yeah. It's really funny.
Yeah. You're like, oh, okay, Miss Piggy's on set. Yeah. I know exactly the bit you're talking about. Yeah.
Interesting.
I remember doing some research on this a while ago, and I remember tracing the kind of reception of Jim Henson throughout the 80s and sort of late 70s, and obviously so this is 82.
Yeah.
But they'd been working on it for 5 years.
They've been working for 5 years,
Yeah.
and obviously we had the Muppet Show and things like that, so it's like height of Henson-dom. And I remember, like, there's a really interesting shift in the reception of the Henson Company thanks to this movie, in that if you read kind of write-ups on the Henson Company sort of in the mid-70s when the Muppet Show's massive, it's all about them as performers, which is important, and I think we've done justice to it, but you can see I'm transitioning to talk about the other aspect of the movie that I think your exhibit shows off really well. And there's this kind of, like, you know, it's almost this kind of spontaneous kind of myth about, like, it's great, you just turn up on set and they just pick up the puppet of Miss Piggy and off they go. And, like, you know, there's such great improvisers and performers, and it's like basically it's like the Henson Company are just you know, like a Punch and Judy show, right? There's like a little stage, they all get behind it and off they go, you know, and things like that. And I think this film played really well for them because it was a big demonstration of their role as an effects, because, you know, this is the same time they're making movies for other, you know, bits for other people and all this sort of stuff. They become for a very brief period before kind of CGI come and ruin everything. They were the kind of, you know, go-to. How do we make a monster? Well, we get the Henson Company in to do it, right?
Yeah.
So this was a film that kind of allowed people to see them as creators of all kinds of kind of special effects, for want of a better term. You know, they're not just performers.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with being a performer, but it's the craft of the world that we've alluded to already that often I think comes across in your exhibition, and often and they did a lot of kind of, you know, exhibitions a bit like this at the time, kind of touring all the art galleries and things like that to show off all these costumes and all these things and all these props that they built. There's a question coming, I promise. And the question is, I guess, given that this is at the British Library and a lot of your exhibition tells the story of the kind of literary fantasy.
Yes.
There's a lot of lovely, he stresses, pages in books and ornate manuscripts and old book, and, you know, the history of fantasy on the page that you so wonderfully demonstrate. Does any of this kind of this sense of the physical fantastic, this sense of the kind of crafted fantastic, was this any part of your decision making in terms of we need something in there? It's not the only thing in the exhibition.
No.
There's some other movie props and there's lots of other bits and pieces like that. But is there anything that you're like, okay, actually, this is part of the story of what we're trying to tell here? You know,
it definitely is, and I think we are always really wary of doing exhibitions that portray books as being in a kind of a weird silo, like they don't relate to the rest of the world. Partly because I think if we did an exhibition that was 100% just books and cases, it would not look very fun for people. We want to really get a mix of media in there. But for fantasy, I think if we'd just done books, it would have just been really a tiny part of the story, because the whole point is that it's a genre that lends itself really well to loads of different formats, and at the moment it's everywhere and using all of these formats really well in different ways. So we've always really been keen to kind of include more visual elements and storytelling in different ways, so like through performance rather than reading.
So how on earth did you whittle down? I mean, how many? I can't remember exactly. There's about three. Did you manage to squeeze 3 or 4 bits of dark crystal?
The dark crystal. So I got 6 things in.
I did. When I saw it, I thought someone likes this movie who is involved in this thing, because because there's a decent amount, just enough for it not to be weird, but at the exact right amount to show off the skill of this movie. But
I
6 is still a tiny amount compared to the amount of stuff they made.
Oh yeah, there's loads.
How on earth did you whittle it down?
I picked things that I would have been super excited to see as a child, on the basis that there were a lot of people who are a similar age to me who would feel the same way. And I just really love Brian Froud's artwork, and Henson Company have got loads of that, and I picked 2 things that really spoke to me because I really loved the Landstriders, and the other piece of artwork we've got is Uruk, the scribe, who's one of the mystics. It's just a really kind of beautiful design. And I really like where they've ended up in the gallery. They're opposite a Kelmscott Press book, which is William Morris's private press. And he was super inspired by these kind of medieval designs and the kind of craft of making things by hand. And I feel like those things, they weren't, I didn't kind of consciously put them really close together. They just ended up that way in the gallery, but I really like the way they kind of speak to each other. And they're also near the amazing collection of material that we've got that was written by the Bronte children, so the three sisters and their brother Bramwell, about their imaginary world that they created in childhood. That again is kind of interesting from a world building perspective, but also through this kind of like a community creating a world, which I think again speaks to like the Dark Crystal and the way that they created it all in a community.
I think community, thank you for mentioning community. We should talk about, because that's the other important aspect of craft that makes it different from some of these other words we might use to describe kind of effects, is that it's not the byproduct of an individual.
No.
It's not creative genius. It's the sense of a crafting, people, which I think helps it's the Henson workshop. It's not just Jim Henson.
No, I was just thinking about, again, I think there's this, obviously, if you've got lots of different fantasies, as you said, like is a kind of multimedia enterprise. Let's say that fantasy reaches across all these different forms of animation and also kind of literary. But I guess there are certain invitations that puppetry make, and I probably put stop motion in a similar category. That there are certain invitations that puppet fantasy or crafted fantasy, or as Alex would call as part of his chapter, crafted wonder. You are welcome. That opens up a conversation of the community. The community is very different to like the production line. The production line of Pixar, they try and make it this like fun place that people are riding around scooters, and you're like, well, that's clearly where are all the women. Like, so there's clearly something going on with the way that the image of the imaginary of certain kinds of animated media. So that Pixar and Disney have a particular way of building their worlds, and obviously the mythology around Jim Henson means that you're trying to curate you're trying to kind of do fantasy justice, but you're also trying to do justice to the wonder that the curation part is you trying to pick things not that best represent fantasy, but best represent our experiences of fantasy, which might not be the same thing, because there are things in fantasy, like obviously there's so many special effects in the movie in terms of like mattes and paintings, but that doesn't represent the way. That's not the fantasy of this film. The fantasy of this film is the puppets and the creatures and the communities and the world that these inhabits and the kind of tensions between these different characters. So I think the idea of I think puppetry and stop motion invite a particular, maybe it's the materiality thing again, that makes fantasy tangible, but they make they invite certain readings in ways that Disney and Pixar don't, and I think that's because of the cell and the wireframe digital image, and then the puppet that you press, and in this film that puppets bleed, it would seem, and so that sort of thing, that sort of these bodies these are bodies that matter and they're made of matter.
It makes me think of. You were talking about, Tanya, about the connections you can draw almost just sort of as a visitor of the exhibit. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes just organically, but help to kind of make people join the dots between a William Morris book.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think two things to point out there is that one, just to also fly the flag, the kind of the British flag of this, is that another thing obviously that it's great that you do is that you're championing some UK labour within this. This film, of course, we keep saying it's Jim Henson. It is a Jim Henson movie. It's made at Elstree Studios. Though it's a British work of love as much as anything else. So that's great that it's part of that kind of story quietly. But the other thing is this idea of the craft and labour creating the fantasy. I mean, there's loads of writing. I think Marina Warner talks loads about this, about household tales, right? Being they have to be told within the household, and she makes loads of interesting links between, like, you know, so many fairy tales have, like, you know, and this happened and then this, like a kind of the repetitive you know, cycle. Someone encounters someone on a road and then they encounter it again the next day and then again the next day, the way fairy tales are structured, and the kind of repetitive nature of household labour, and the fact that these are stories really told between I mean, they're household tales, they're old wives' tales. Again, back to gender here. It's actually, these stories aren't, quote unquote, about women in domestic labour, but they can only be told by women in domestic labour, because that's the labour conditions by which their fantasies are being fueled and things like that. And I think we should...
I'm really excited about the question you're going to ask after this.
It's going to be good, isn't it? It's going to be good. Well, I guess, like, it's one of the themes we're talking about here, which is that the labour conditions, the material world in which these artists are working within, the fact that Henson functions as a community, things like that, these are all part of the story of what makes something imaginative. People think fantasy is this kind of, what you do is you sit and you just, I'm going to imagine a world, and like that. I mean, therefore it's this escapist kind of vacuum, right? But actually,
it's work as well.
It's work.
Yeah.
It's work, and it's related to. It's not based on reality. No. It's related to reality.
Yeah.
I'll shut up now. But like, I always say to my students, that stupid caption that they put in front of the films, like, you know, inspired by true events. Like, well, that's all stories ever. Like, The Wizard of Oz is inspired by true events. In that a person had some true events, then was inspired and wrote a story. So all fiction, all fantasy has a tangible link to the world in which you're living in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be about that world for it to have that link.
Okay,
We're coming towards the end, actually, so before we talk a little bit about the exhibit and the other fantastical, not pun intended, things within it, are there any final notes you've got, Chris, that you want us to talk about?
No.
Animation for your...
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think there are certain films within your timeline of special effects that are, and this is one of those. This is, and in many ways, you would know more about this than me, but the sort of, there's something, again, potentially, I don't know, quite political about if Hollywood is moving, or the industry is moving into digital technology. This is quite a nice... I mean, there are different forms of image making. So obviously the puppets, we spent a lot of time. I also wrote down holograms, ? At the end, where you have these sort of like Pepper's Ghost. Yeah, you have these sort of... Okay. And I'm increasingly interested in holograms and like going to see ABBA on tour and things like this, and kind of posthumous holograms and this sort of stuff. But I was thinking about, again, this is another... The prioritising of one kind of special effect in a movie like The Dark Crystal maybe tips the scales away from some other interesting visual effects and the use of light and the reflections of these sort of like kind of ghostly bodies. And I was thinking about, Pepper's Ghost and sort of lineages. Going back to this point about genealogies, that fantasy is, you can trace themes, but you can also trace these technologies of fantasy. That technologies, these reproductive technologies, allow us to sort of see where fantasy is this space where technology is often prioritised, both in front and behind the camera. You can kind of trace those interesting lineages. So I just put, I don't really know whether I just put holograms effect at the end. Pepper's Ghost.
I hadn't realised they were holograms.
I don't know what they are, but they have the... No, I don't know how they did that. But that's interesting, because I think you've both spoken about the makings of. Yeah. It's interesting that these are really, again, political spaces where they're not going to tell you how that's made, because that's not interesting. Yeah. The puppets are interesting because it's Jim Henson. So there are also these registers of like disclosure, the things that you are supposed to know about fantasy. Yeah. And so and maybe the museum, sort of the idea of the kind of the curation, the museum space is functions like everything is curated. Disney curates its own history. Jim Henson curates the own way that we're supposed to engage with his movies. Yes. We don't know anything about the Pepper's Ghost thing, and who cares? But we like to know about the puppets, and I find that interesting. These registers of invisibility. It doesn't quite, but that's we always teach our students to lean into the chaos. So it's chaotic that we don't know how this is made, but that's okay.
It's actually a really good moment, because actually it's the one moment, because the crystal starts glowing at that point. It's the one moment where we might get something towards traditional animation, and it's interesting because it's the moment things get particularly odd and ethereal and otherworldly on screen, and
Well, I remember...
There's that line, isn't there? What is it? In our arrogance, we shattered the crystal.
Yeah.
I've always wondered what the hell that means.
Yes.
Were they like having a piss up or something? And like, in our arrogance, I poured some beer over it.
Yeah. And who brought that traffic home? Yeah.
It's always bugged me. What does that mean?
I always found them really unsatisfying as a child. So it's when the Skeksis and the Mystics kind of blend back into single beings instead of being split halves, and they are so weird looking that I was like, I don't know what to make of this.
Like octopus faced, like
like very tall, kind of glowing white, like genderless, but I guess there's lots of genderless figures in this film. I don't know.
And they feel not of the world.
They feel not of the world, yeah.
And I guess that, and it sounds I don't know exactly how they were made, but they're technologically not of the world in the sense that there's clearly something going on, whether it's just a kind of set of back projections or something's going on with the image there to make it not quite as felt and tangible as the rest of it.
Yeah.
Why do that then? Is it a case of like, we talked a lot about the kind of one part of the pleasure of this, the kind of imperfection of it, the googly eyes stuck on the on the monsters. This is an imperfect world. It says that in the plot at the beginning, right? This is a fallen world. This is a world with a shard missing. So it's a bit too once it's fixed.
They kind of beam away, and then you're just it's just the two gelflings and Fizzgig left. I don't know.
What they're going to get up to now? Yeah. Well, I guess like that's why the sequel is a prequel.
Yes, exactly.
I guess we haven't got to talk about like what did you think of the
Age of Resistance?
Yeah. There's absolutely no way Chris has seen this. I just wanted to look and just check.
So it's a Netflix
series. You don't have a conversation now about
quick nod of recognition.
80% of the things you won't understand, but that's fine. Yeah, what do you think?
It's great. Yeah, I mean they use loads of the same techniques, and it really shows. But there's some like subtle enhancements.
How does it fit in relation to world building? Because I'm interested in this idea of world building, and obviously, if everything is puppetry in something like Dark Crystal, then it risks homogenizing the world, and so you have these moments of effect. Can animated films have special effects? Yes, they can. Even though the whole thing is an effect, yes, they can. How does the Age of Resistance fit in with the world building? Does it sort of, because obviously prequels, that's part of their job as well. They have to not destabilize the world. They have to extend it. And so does it? How does that work?
I think it worked really well because they'd already designed way more than they needed for the film, so they could just use all of that. So there's bits of the world that you don't see in the film that you can kind of explore in Age of Resistance, and that's one of the kind of wonders of the amount of work that goes into this kind of thing, that it leaves loads of spaces that you can fill in later, and that's what loads of fan fiction does, and that's exactly what they did with Age of Resistance.
But actually that's the other thing, that writing on fictional worlds, they always the good stuff on fictional worlds is like fictional worlds are supposed to be incomplete because they're supposed to not the reason why the fictional world of Toy Story is so convincing is because there is information that is known to everybody and to some, and so Buzz Lightyear doesn't know that he's a toy, and that's believable because in the world there are people that don't know things. It'd be weird if everybody knew things, and so it's about kind of these different registers of knowledge and different hierarchies of knowledge and stuff like this. So worlds are always supposed to be incomplete and partial, so that because you can only see parts of them, but they can hint at. Like in Rear Window is a perfect example. Everything happens but that alleyway, the most interesting bit of Rear Window is not what happens in the rooms. It's the little slither of the alleyway where people go past and you're like, well, something's happening over here and I can't. So fictional worlds are always supposed to be incomplete, whether that's because they can't build the rest, they didn't have money to build the rest of the street, or they're supposed to be things that occur in your mind that's supposed to be denoted, and then you connote things from that. And it feels like fantasy is really... Like fantasy and animation has to do that. It's all kind of connotative. It's all partial. But again, that's okay. Like fictional was supposed to be incomplete. Just supposed to fill in there. And the fan thing, I guess, is important to that as well. Like fan fiction, as you said.
And just to say one word about Age of Resistance, because I think it's fabulous, is that it does such a good job at playing with everything you just said, Chris, and you've said, Tanya, but also the kind of politics of perception of a world. And I think it's actually a really interesting not to go too kind of glib, but I genuinely think it's a really interesting discussion of like post-truth, of like, it's a very...
Talks more about society
It's really, I loved it, and I was ashamed that, I think it did fine, didn't it? But it's a very costly thing and all this kind of stuff. But hey, but in 20 years they'll do something else, because that's how the dark crystal works, isn't it? It
was 2019, wasn't it, as well? So I'm sure COVID kind of like factored into it being cancelled. But I would love it if they would do more.
You have pages of notes, Tanya, which not all guests bless us with notes. So is there anything that we haven't mentioned
that you would like to? Yeah.
The notes almost look like they are designing a world. I can't see what they would say.
Stick those in the exhibit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Have you got a favourite bit? Maybe that's a good... We often ask like visual effects artists or animators, is there a bit that they really like to work on? Whether it's your favourite bit because it's brilliant, or animators often go, I really hate that sequence because it took me a year to do that, 10 seconds. But is there a bit that you think kind of encapsulates the film?
Huge sequence, or it can be like a small moment.
Yeah.
I think my favourite bit as a child was the bit where he literally heals the crystal. Jen heals the crystal. My favourite bit watching it as an adult, I think, is the orrery, which I did also love as a child, because I just loved the way it moves. So it's like a kind of giant model of the solar system, but way more complicated than our solar system, and it kind of moves so beautifully, almost like it's back to this kind of idea of like movement being so important to the whole film. I just think it's such a beautiful sequence, and that's the bit with the Orca in it as well, and she's awesome. So
classic. I two bits for me. I like the fact there are 3 shards. So he has to find the shard in Olga, and she gets out 3, and he has to find the right one. That makes me always think, what are the other 2 then? Where do they go?
Random crystals.
They're back to world building, and then there's a line in it where they're like where he meets Kira. We're talking about Kira. I've spoken about Kira, the female gelfling. There's another conversation to be had about that in a different podcast, but. They meet in a swamp, don't they? And she does this like thing to get him out of the swamp.
Yes.
And she makes this like call, and this creature, like toad-like thing, like lifts him out of the swamp, and then kind of goes back in. And he's like, "What's that?" And she just goes, "It's just a nebri." And that's it. Like,
but then in the next scene, the Skeksis are eating one.
Oh yeah, that's right. Roasted nebri.
Like,
yeah. So the next prequel needs to be about the story of the nebri race and where they came from. Before they came such a delicious roasted accompaniment to Skeksy dinners. Yeah.
My other favourite bit is Kira rescues Jen by like suddenly unfurling these wings that you didn't know she had, and then he's like, "Well, I don't have wings."
Yeah,
you
like,
well, of course not.
You're a boy. Yeah. I like that. I think that's that and the hologrammy bit are my favourite bits. I liked that. I don't have wings. Of course not. You're a boy, because I was like, how does gender play it? So the academic in me came rising to the surface. I liked the sort of like Pepper's go the Urskeks, the angel. That. Because it made me think about the different ways that I have thought about this film, and the immateriality of that. I thought that was quite fun.
Cool.
Anyway,
let's ask you just a couple of questions about the exhibit more broadly, because people are now hopefully tantalised that there's some fun dark crystal stuff. That is by no means the entire story. So let's just remind everyone, it's called Fantasy Realms of Imagination, and it runs till the 25th of February. I'm going to say that you can get it from a fantasy.c-tickets, S-E-E tickets.com. Go there and you can get the tickets there. I'll say that again at the end of the podcast in case you missed it. But give us what else could we look forward to in the exhibit?
There is so much stuff in there.
Yeah.
So we tried to tell the whole history of the fantasy genre in about 100 exhibits. So that's a massively challenging task, but I'm really proud of it. So we kind of trace the roots of fantasy from the oldest forms of storytelling. So we look at folktale, fairy tale, epics from the ancient world, and what they've all lent to modern fantasy, how fantasy is kind of constantly drawing on these like older threads to weave a kind of a new work. And then we look at kind of fantasy and the weird, and how the kind of weird and uncomfortable feelings can give you a sense of wonder, and then the exhibition concludes with a section that looks at the history of world building, which is where the dark crystal material appears, and also on fan culture, and how fan culture is kind of like a world in its own self, but also transforms kind of canonical fantasy into new worlds that constantly regenerate.
really, it's a really great. And then for film fans, there's some Lynchian stuff in there, David Lynch. So I won't spoil it for those who want to see it. But yeah, and the kind of the structures of the fantasy. So you go through ancient folk tales, fairy stories, gothic horror, weird fiction. World building. I'm probably forgetting one or two, but the kind of the way you structure it. It's not chronological, but it's not chronological.
It's kind of themes and taking these threads that lead you through the genre. Because we wanted people to be able to make connections between like ancient and new all the way through, and we also didn't want it all to be very kind of high culture. So there's a real like mix of kind of modes of telling stories as well.
Yeah. So it's kind of like recovering, I wouldn't say lost fantasy, but kind of inspiring people, as you said, to make those connections, but doing so, again, through this act of recovery, saying actually these things need to be and could be seen together, or deserve to be seen together as well.
Yeah, so we've got like our medieval manuscript of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is one of the library's great treasures, and then that's opposite a case that looks at the sword and sorcery boom in the mid-20th century, and what those two things tell you about what it is like being a hero. And there's a clip of Xenia, warrior princess, in there as well. So, getting people to kind of reassess this idea that heroes have to be a certain way, and actually fantasy's complicated that ever since medieval.
So it's doing what fantasy films do then, which is that fantasy heroes don't have to look a specific way.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
I feel like fantasy does that a lot. You're basically doing, you've modelled, you're telling the story of fantasy, but you are telling a fantasy narrative because
Yeah.
And there's some really cool maps.
Yeah.
And there's some really cool maps.
Yes.
Cool. Yeah.
So, to remind everyone, that's fantasy. You can get your tickets at fantasy.ctickets.com, and they're available to the 25th of February, so snap them up while you can. I'd really recommend it. I had the pleasure of looking around it a few weeks ago, and it is both dense and light at the same time, depending on how one engages with it and how one chooses to engage with it, and that's a real amazing skill. So congratulations. He claps silently into the microphone so as not to destroy his pop filter.
Yes, I was going to say to avoid you having to muck around with the sound levels, whatever. Yeah.
Otherwise, Tanya, thanks so much for geeking out with us about the Dark Crystal and
no problem.
And telling us a bit of the world building there. I think there's some fascinating stuff to think about. It's such a great movie. We couldn't really do it justice, but hey, what can you do in an hour?
So much you can say,
So much you can say.
I will say one final quick plug, which is that we have an accompanying book with the exhibition, which is called Realms of Imagination, and the final so it's a collection of essays from all different kinds of writers. So some are kind of creative practitioners, like authors, artists, and some are more kind of academic based. And they're all kind of given different perspectives on the genre. And the final essay in the book is by Wendy Froud, who created the Gelflings for Lord of the Rings, for the Dark Crystal. And it's just a really lovely, beautiful account of her processes and a kind of personal look behind the film.
Okay. The book is called
Realms of Imagination.
Realms of Imagination.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Terrific. Okay, and can be purchased wherever you buy books. Terrific.
Exactly.
Wherever you buy books. We're at the British Library. They sort of have some here. Unbelievable.
Great. Thank you, Tanya, for coming on the show. Really, really, really appreciate it. You can follow us at fantasy-animation.org and access the archive of podcasts and blogs there. You can follow us on all the social medias, no matter what they're called.
Or who buys them.
Or who buys them at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. And you can suggest future footnote episodes at the same thing.
Yeah, we should do puppetry and stuff like that. Yeah.
Fananim Research, FANANIM Research at gmail.com. We'll also put links to the tickets.
Yeah, everything Tanya said, we will hyperlink so people have no excuses not to find you online.
Check this out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that's been us for another week, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.